All right, we continue on with our discussion from our previous video that for ages 6 to 12, we really want to focus on how to address a lack of character. And in our previous video, we also pointed out, scripturally speaking, a lack of character. It's always a sign of idolatry. Because what's going on? Someone is worshiping something else. A child is worshiping something else other than God to serve self. So in regard to not helping, when a child should, the child is worshiping comfort, laziness, happiness, because they feel like that's better for them than if they should have to put themselves out there and help mom or dad. A child who is acting out in class, trying to make his friends laugh, exercising bad behavior, and not open rebellion against the teacher, but they just can't help it. That is bowing down to acceptance, peer pressure, because it serves self. And in the mind of that child, they feel like, well, that's so much better than having to obey my teacher and then being made fun of by my classmates. Or the little girl that is ruling over everyone on the playground because she feels like she has to be Little Miss Sovereign. What is she doing? She's really worshiping ultimate power, control, which she believes will serve self instead of God, and allowing others to have a turn and others to have a say because she's afraid she'll miss out on blessings. She's afraid that maybe she won't be accepted unless she controls the situation. So there's a lot of fear that's going to be behind all of this too. So here's what we want to do. This is what we need to do after we recognize these things, and that's something we want to train ourselves to. Whenever we see a lack of character, there's always idolatry. Can you point out the false idol? We want to communicate this to them. And we don't want to just tell them, but we want them to, again, we're pulling off the blinders, to see the idolatry that's involved and what they're guilty of. So we're going to use the law. And we're going to do so in a question. We're going to ask our children in situations where there's wrong behavior. Right now, here's a question we're going to ask. What's most important to you? So when a parent feels like, boy, my kids, they don't have any Christian character. They know this needs to get done. I've shared my hope that maybe I could get some help. It's not their job, but it sure would be nice to stop and say, hey, I want to ask you, what's most important to you right now? Here are some needs. I know it's work. You're not doing it. So what's most important to you? And to help them along with confession. To that little boy that's misbehaving, and again, you get a teacher's note to say, so what's going on in your head? What's most important to you when your teacher's teaching and your friends are there and you decide to entertain them and help them understand this is an idol thing? Same thing with the girl who's ruling over the others. Like, what's going on? What's most important to you? When you see that these other children aren't getting a choice because you're demanding your way, what's the most important and why? So as we help our children understand these things, we want to point out natural consequences too. As you're driving them to understand that they're really worshiping themselves. The natural consequences, what is that? Well, when it comes to not helping people in need, you become so self-focused that no one's going to help you in need. When it comes to that boy misbehaving in class, well, he is being influenced by bad behavior. What's the natural consequence? If he does this as an adult, he's going to go to jail. Because if he hangs around with the wrong crowd and he rejects authority, he's going to lose all his privileges. So a good consequence would be for him to lose some privileges, to have to go to his room, to not have screen time, to not be able to do whatever's fun, to pull him out of his sports or whatever else he's involved in, to let him know this is what happens. These are natural consequences. When you run with the wrong crowd, when you take pride and joy in bad behavior, that gets you in trouble as an adult, and you lose big time. Again, a child in that previous example that doesn't help others in need, well, then they won't be helped when they're in need. So to give them a task, a chore that's really difficult, that they really flounder in for a little while, and then to lovingly come along and help them. But after some time when they're really struggling, that might be a good consequence. How about that girl that rules over all the others to have no friends? Again, to be isolated, another consequence. These are all natural consequences so these are the things that you reap when you sow sinful things, lack of character. If those consequences can be as natural as possible, a foretaste of what's to come if they don't break through this character issue, that's going to be very beneficial because they'll be able to connect the dots. Like, oh, this is what happens when I show this lack of character. Where appropriate, then, we want to make sure that they reap the consequences that fit. Bad behavior ultimately means loss of something, loss of privileges or whatever. Then, as we point all these things out, of course, we want this to predominate. We want to give them the gospel. And as you tell them the gospel, but my dear child, God loves you. I know you didn't see the need. But do you know this? This is precisely why Christ came. He knew that you didn't see the need and that you're not prone to because of your sinful nature. But so he satisfied our need. He became the great good Samaritan, and only he can. And to walk alongside them and say, I know because I do the same things in my heart. I remember being your age. I remember struggling in similar ways. I even to this day struggle. Sharing the gospel and the hope that Christ alone can give. You'll do two things. One, you'll build up your child, and you'll begin to give them the power for good character. The other thing is, too, they're going to see like, oh, this Jesus person, he means everything to my dad, to my mom, and the model you leave there, that's everything. So the gospel must predominate. And again, you can go in all sorts of ideas in that. If your child is being lazy and they've got all these things on the list of things to do, and they procrastinate, who of us can't relate to that? And then instead of getting angry at them, it's like, why don't you get to it? And why are you so lazy? To say, look, you know what? I do want to talk to you because this is disconcerting. This is not going to serve you well. You're going to miss deadlines. You're going to lose out by doing this. In fact, here's a punishment for you. You aren't getting to these things. So now you got another thing and you're losing out on free time because I've got to teach you that you've got to be on top of things. But I want you to know I understand too. I struggle to get to work on time. I struggle to pay my taxes with joy on time or whatever else. And, and we relate and we say, this is why we need Jesus. He covers over all that. And he motivates us now to do these things on time, even ahead of time. So don't take their bad behavior personally. I think this is one of the biggest mistakes we parents that we make. We often get frustrated, we get angry, we lash out, and we act like I'm holier than thou. But we are more like our children than we would care to admit. And the beauty of God's grace is he empowers us to admit it. And surprise of all surprises, our kids actually respect us more when they can relate to us more. And I know we're afraid that, well, if I show them my faults, one, I might make them feel very burdened. Well, we don't want to burden them with our faults. And we don't have to disclose every detail. But I think the other thing is we're going to lose their respect. You know what's going to cause them to lose respect for you? Is if you put standards that are far too high for them to reach. And they see in you that you don't even attain to these standards. Hypocrisy. That's what will cause our kids to lose respect for us. And oh, by the way, if we're too vulnerable and we're afraid that we're going to be too open with them, we can always appeal to the fact that they need to respect and love us anyway because God established that and God did that for their good. See, that's our every reason for having respect from our children. So give them the gospel. Give them the gospel. And when you do, tell them how much you need it to. So I want you to do this. This might be a moment where you could just talk a little bit about these things. First of all, what are some of the idols that you recognize in the heart of your children, which need knocking down? Every child is going to be different. Some children are going to gravitate toward this. Some children are going to be outwardly more conforming, perhaps. Some children are going to struggle more with behavior issues or selfishness in this regard or that regard. Do you have a good sense of, first of all, what is the struggle of my child here and my child there and this child of mine? And now connect the dots. What idol is that? What are they bowing down to because they think they're serving self? Are they inclined to worship comfort? Are they lazy? Do they worship pleasure? Will they not help? Are they selfish? Do they refuse to share? Do they not get along? Are they isolated from others? Peer pressure, acceptance. Do they misbehave for attention? When they obey, do you know why they do that too? So this is the flip side of idolatry. They might obey because, well, I get mom off my back. Or they might obey, say, well, I really need my parents to accept me. I really need my teacher to accept me. They could be a grade slave because they're afraid. And so they bow down to the altar of fear. Is it out of fear? Is it out of shame? Is it out of guilt? Are they working the system? Or is it from the gospel that has now inspired their character? So there's all sorts of idols for us to uncover. That's the nature of our sinful hearts. Thankfully, we can relate to our children. Even more so, thankfully, we have God who's there to forgive and to give us new character. So tools for character development. I want to spend the rest of our time in this video just talking a little bit about how to help them grow in their character. So we should recognize that problems are our opportunities. So this is a shift in mindset, right? And maybe we've heard this again and again, but tell yourself, practice this. When your child messes up, whether act of rebellion or a lack of character, train your mind to say, this is an opportunity to share the gospel, and crucify this temptation to get frustrated, to see it as an obstacle for you to do something else. Your call is to be a parent, and every problem your child exhibits is an opportunity to go on a rescue mission, to have a beautiful conversation, to point out rebellion and lack of character, the law, the consequences, yes, that follow, but to let the gospel predominate. So, every problem is, number one, an opportunity to teach, to instruct. Say the child is upset and disruptive because his siblings are slightly, they get a slightly bigger piece at the kitchen table for dinner, a piece of pizza or whatever, right? And they're upset. Instead of saying, well, go to your room, I don't care if you starve because you're frustrated, say, okay, hold on, everyone. Let's talk about what's going on here. What makes you upset? That your bigger brother got a bigger piece. What does Jesus' sacrifice say about the portion that he gave you? Right? I mean, bringing Jesus right into the conversation. That's what we're called to do. So what should you do when you're upset? You're disruptive because things aren't fair. Right? And that's an abbreviated conversation, but just say, why are you upset? And you see that it's not really because he has a bigger piece. It's because you're worshiping greed. And if you want to talk about fair, was it fair that Jesus would give up everything and let you have the bigger piece? That's exactly what he did by his life and his death and resurrection. Who deserved more? But Jesus gave it up for you. And you're forgiven and you're loved. Problems are opportunities to correct. So not only to teach, but to correct. What does that mean? Well, go back to that supper dispute. Point out what your child desired and why, right? That's idolatry. The bigger piece, greed. Confirm what your child should have desired and why. The smaller piece, so that the neighbor gets more, right? Just as Jesus gave up everything for us to have more, although everything was rightfully his. Teach them to say, let's replay this. So here's the correction part. Let's start again. Let's say instead of acting up and being disruptive, you saw this happen. What could you have said, inspired by your love for Jesus? Teach your child to say, you know what? Yeah, have the bigger piece. I truly want you to be happier than me. And I'm glad you can have that. That's what Christian character looks like. Opportunities, problems again, they're opportunities to plead with them, right? Really to plead with them, to understand the danger of their nature, right? To say, if you keep complaining when things aren't fair and you disrupt, what will happen? Nobody will want to be around you. Nobody will want to have dinner with you. They'll think you're selfish and you'll be isolated, right? There's only consequences here. Please, I need you to see that. Will you tell me that you understand that? Problems are opportunities to be an example. So this does not mean that you have to portray yourself as perfect, right? But you want to be humble. Let them know that you have some like, you know what? I get it. My sinful nature desires the biggest piece too. I mean, after all, I'm your dad. I own all this. I bought the pizza. So I get it. I mean, my sinful nature is telling me I would rather have that. But you know what? I've learned, and I'm still learning more. I get so much delight in seeing you guys get a big share. Jesus said himself, it's better to give than to receive. Problems are opportunities, to rebuke. Maybe a thought should be given here. A rebuke it gets a bad rap, but it shouldn't. It's a biblical word. Literally, to rebuke is showing God's standard of perfection, not one's own standard. It may depend on the day and obsessive nature and compare their character to it. So those are things that we fall into where we set standards. Maybe our mood persuades. Rebuking is showing see the standards that we set where the child said, this isn't fair. Those are your standards. What are God's standards? God's standards are love him and love others more than yourself. Right? So we point out the standard that is God's. And we praise Jesus for his perfection that he's given. So kind of a twin of correction, right? We tell them what they should do. But again, we're pointing out in rebuke, notice that you're judging things by your standards. We are to judge things by God's standards. So here's a key point. Parenting is a process, right? I mean, all of this seems somewhat laborious. It would just be easier to say, just cut it out. Go to your room. You're being selfish. But that's not going to change the heart. And it's not going to happen. You got to pray for patience. This is God's way of teaching us patience, because this whole thing's going to play out perhaps at every dinner for 5, 10, maybe even 15 years. And especially even more if we don't address the heart. So take the time. Train yourself to see every issue, rebellion, or lack of character is an opportunity to go on a rescue mission and to share the gospel after pointing out the law and the consequences. Here's the hard truth. You can't really develop good character in your child unless you yourself are growing in good character. This would be an excellent time to have an honest conversation with your spouse, or to open up to your children and ask, what is it that you don't like so much about my parenting? What is it about my character that needs work, honey? And to be humble enough to hear. Here's the beautiful thing, though. When we're vulnerable with our kids, that will endear us to them. They will understand, especially when we're vulnerable and say that Christ is our strength. He's our forgiveness. And they will grow in their love for Jesus. And you'll create a context where they feel comfortable in talking to you, so that when they get to the point in life where they see their act of rebellion and their tendency to it, they'll come to you and they'll confess their sin. When they see their lack of character and it's pointed out to them, or they see it themselves, they'll confess their sin to you. And that's the goal, so that you can give them the gospel. All right, here's maybe an assessment. 3 perspectives to test whether or not your children are developing in character. Ask them, or just try to assess, how do they relate to God? For example, do you do home devotions? If not, I would encourage you. This is part of developing your character, right? You want to teach them to love Jesus. There's no better way than exposing them to Jesus. Do they like family devotions? I mean, they might not always want to sit down and do them, but do they understand and appreciate the blessing that comes out of them? Do they engage with you in spiritual family discussions? Are they attentive at Sunday school? Are they getting Christ out of it? Why do they want to go to church, if at all, right? So that's how you can assess whether or not they're growing in Christian character. We want to encourage them to love these things. And the only way to do that is to make them beautiful, to continually point out to them how these things are everything to you. How does your child relate to himself or herself? Again, assessing whether or not they're growing in Christian character. Are they self-excusing? Do they rationalize their sin? Do they swindle others out of things and try to get things? Are they selfish? Are they personally responsible? Or do you have to hover over them all the time? That's a sign of a lack of character. How do they relate to others? Right? So God, others, and how do they, are they humble? That's the thought about themselves. How do they relate to others? What do others think about them? Are they a joy to be around? Do you perceive that? Ask the parents of the children they hang out with, what do you think about my child? Be willing to hear whatever. Generally, they're going to paint the best picture because they don't want to hurt your feelings. But be wise and perceptive. Like, how are your peers, your children's friends, how are they received? And here's the beauty. When you know the truth, as hard as it might be, if there's a struggle, there's always a room for grace. And this is why you're here as a parent. You can build them up in good character so that their friends take note and say, they've changed. I never realized it. They're actually kind of fun to be around. I mean, that's worst case scenario stuff, right? Can they explain ultimately, here's the way to assess Christian character. Can they explain how the gospel applies to their relationship with God, their relationship with others, and how they see themselves, God willing, humbly? All right, one last thought, and I'll leave you to those various questions to discuss. What are the biggest obstacles hindering your building of the gospel motivated character in your child? What are the biggest obstacles for you to build up a gospel motivated character in your child? Next time, we will talk a little bit about how to address and what we're looking for with our teens. So ages 13 on up. God's blessings as you continue to grow in your love of the Lord and in your calling as parents.